Good morning, all. My original plan was to wait until next year to create a video on overwintering potatoes. And basically this is planting potatoes in the fall. They kind of sit in a semi-dormant state until the spring when they sprout up and start growing. And you usually get an early summer harvest. I really wanted to come up with the perfect method before I shared it with you all. But after I shared a post on this topic the other day, I had so many great questions and comments and suggestions that I thought I'd just go ahead and share with you all what I've got going on so far. So first, for anyone who is new to the channel, I am growing in Midwestern Ohio. I'm zone 6A, so our typical lowest winter low is right around -5 to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't usually have a lot of snow cover through the winter. All kind of factors that play into overwintering crops like this. Now, I tried overwintering potatoes for the first time last year and was a little disappointed in the results. The yield was relatively small, and they were actually slower to get growing and later to mature than my spring planted spuds. But I've got quite a few little spuds that are already sprouting. These are from this past summer's harvest. Unfortunately, I lost my cool storage area, so things have not been keeping as well for me as they normally do this year. So I figured it would be the perfect opportunity to try overwintering potatoes again. But this year I am making some tweaks and trying some different methods to see if I can get better results than last year. The main thing with overwintering potatoes is to get them planted deep enough that they don't freeze and insulate the planting area. So I plant deeper than I would a spring planted potato. Trenching to about 12 to 18 inches deep seems to be the general recommendation, and mulching with something insulating, say hay, straw, or leaf mulch, is crucial. Related to this, if you, like me, have really wet winters and early springs, be sure to pick a planting site with excellent drainage. Now, being that my native soil is heavy clay, even if my spuds survive the winter, if they sit in the spring in damp, saturated, cold soil, they are going to rot. So I opt for planting either in raised beds or in areas of my garden at a slightly higher elevation that has really nice, well-amended, good draining soil. Another key to success is keeping hungry critters, especially voles and mice, from nibbling on your spuds come midwinter when there's very little else to eat. Likewise, curious squirrels and chipmunks might like to dig up your beds just to see what kind of delicacies you may have buried for them. The best line of defense is probably raised beds lined underneath with hardware cloth and then covered on top with something like chicken wire or netting or more hardware cloth. Now, chicken wire is not small enough to keep mice and voles from tunneling underneath, but I have found it useful in keeping squirrels and chipmunks from digging into the top of the beds. Last year, I planted some of my potatoes into a raised bed that was lined with landscape or weed fabric barrier underneath, which seemed to do the trick in keeping nibbling critters out. I had other problems with it, but it did keep the voles out of my beds. The potatoes that I planted in an unprotected in-ground bed sadly were all eaten up. So let me share with you exactly how I grew my potatoes last year. I planted on November 9th. I've heard quite a bit of variation on the best timing for planting overwintered potatoes, but it seems as a general rule of thumb, it's about the same timing that you would use for fall planted garlic. My main thing was that I did not want my potatoes planted and given enough time to put on a bunch of leafy green growth before that really cold weather set in. So first, I dug a trench. This one ended up being only about 8 inches deep, but my potatoes were okay and they didn't freeze over the winter. I placed my potatoes in the trench. Normally, I cut my seed potatoes into pieces with at least one eye per piece to stretch my planting a little bit. But in this case, I used smaller whole potatoes, placing them about 6 inches apart. Next, I added a couple of inches of aged cow manure on top of the potatoes. Then I filled the trench back in with all the dirt I had dug out. And I mulched the entire bed with chopped leaves. And finally, as I mentioned, I covered the bed with old window screens in an attempt to keep the chipmunks and squirrels from digging in the bed. And here is the harvest in mid-July. These were dug at the same time as many of my spring planted potatoes, but were much further behind in maturity. You can see here that the foliage is still green, not dying back at all yet, and the tubers were still quite small. I could have likely left these in the garden for another month, but was finding it difficult to keep up on the watering in this bed, and potatoes generally stop setting tubers once the weather gets above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, as it often does here in July and August. So I went ahead and dug them. Despite being less than thrilled with this harvest, I really want this concept to work because it's a great way to utilize potatoes that have already sprouted that aren't going to hold until spring for planting when I'm in a situation where I just can't get them all eaten or preserved in time. So now I'm going to share how I'm changing things up for planting this year. For my first planting, I basically went with the same method that I used last year with a few subtle tweaks. The main difference is that I went into a bed with a better quality soil that was not lined underneath with landscape barrier. The bed I planted into last year was basically no better than cruddy planting soil. It was quick to dry out, low in nutrients, low in microbial life, fine for growing things like lettuce and herbs, not so great for growing potatoes. As an aside, I'm in the process of completely ripping that bed out and starting over, but that's a video for another day. The soil in this bed is of much better quality and won't be as hard to keep watered come the heat of July. And I also wanted to try some other folks' suggestions for doing this. And of course, I had to add my own little tweaks to fit the materials that I had on hand and my own specific growing conditions, but I'm excited to see how these methods do. The first suggestion came from Mark in Zone 7A, and he says he has had great success overwintering potatoes. Now, his method is to dig a trench deep enough to keep the potatoes below the frost line. So I opted for about a 12-inch trench here. The next step is to place a good layer of straw in the bottom of the trench. Now, I used alfalfa hay as that is what I had on hand. Next, place the potatoes on top of the straw, or hay in my case, and then put another layer of straw on top of the potatoes and cover with dirt. Once they're all covered, you mulch them again with straw or leaves. The second suggestion came from Adrienne in Zone 8B. Now, I'm actually tweaking her method quite a bit. Being as Adrienne is further south than me, her days are a little warmer, her day length is a little longer yet this time of year. So her original method is actually for actively growing potatoes through the winter. I love this idea and I want to try her method verbatim next year. I will just change it up and start my potatoes a little earlier. But here is what I ended up doing as a method to overwinter my potatoes here in Zone 6. Her first step is to dig the trench deep and wide, at least a foot down and 3 feet wide. And she added a comment in there, "Don't hate me." Next, put a layer of almost ready compost down. And then place plain cardboard in the middle 18 inches of your trench. She says it can be more, but at least the middle 18 inches. Next, put a thin layer of good garden soil in that middle 18 inches only, and place your potatoes right in the middle. Then cover these potatoes with more dirt. Next, we go in and on 5 inches on either side of this trench, we put compost that's almost ready but not quite. So we want stuff that's not fully broken down yet. And in the final outside 4 inches of the trench, put some hot compost down, like chicken coop shavings hot. Now here's where I started to diverge from her original instructions. I didn't want that extra heat as I'm not trying to actively grow them right now. So I didn't use brand new hot chicken litter. This is some aged chicken litter that's probably about half composted already. The original idea is all about generating heat to push those potatoes into growth. But like I said, I don't want my potatoes growing that quickly right now. Finally, we cover the entire thing with hay or straw. I used leaf mulch as that is what I had on hand. And her final step is to hoop it over with clear plastic when it's below 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and then open it up and let it breathe when it's warmer. Now, I didn't do either. The hoop plus the decomposing compost, again, is gonna provide enough heat to keep those potatoes actively growing. And that's not necessarily what I wanted happening right now. I want my spuds in a semi-dormant state so they can sit underground through the winter and then jump into growth in the spring. But what I love about Adrian's suggestion is that this method could easily be tweaked to offer some season extension for other crops, things like cold hardy leafy greens or other cold hardy root vegetables. And it's gonna give you quite a bit of season extension on either end of the season. So getting started earlier in the spring or extending that season out into the fall. I'm also thinking that it might be a way for folks in colder climates to warm up their soil enough to possibly overwinter potatoes. Now, with all of these plantings, I have to be on alert for hungry voles. They will happily munch away at my tubers when there's nothing else for them to eat in the winter. As I mentioned earlier, probably the best line of defense is hardware cloth lined raised beds, as they cannot chew through that or fit through the small openings of hardware cloth. Chicken wire won't stop them, so don't waste your time. Now, I've still got hardware cloth lined raised beds on my ever-growing to-do list, but I didn't get them done for this year. So what I'm resorting to now are bait stations. I'm using kaput rat, mouse, and vole bait. I'm opting for this bait because the active ingredient, warfarin, is ranked among the safest rodenticides by the EPA and is the least toxic poison bait to non-target animals. Warfarin is also far less likely to result in a secondary kill, that is, a death of another animal being poisoned from eating the poisoned voles or mice. I'm using these PVC bait stations as these protect the bait from non-target animals and seem to be the most welcoming to little rodents. The key is to tuck them into leaf litter or straw so that they're somewhat protected. I'll check these once or twice a week through the winter and add more bait as needed. Now stay tuned, because next summer I plan to share the results of all of these different plantings, and I'll let you know if I end up with that perfect planting technique for overwintering potatoes. In the meantime, if you have any suggestions, be sure to drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.